Hi class, this week we're going to be talking about how to determine what good high quality classroom assessment is and how to take some steps to ensure that you administer that. So today's agenda, we'll talk about high quality assessment, what it is. We'll discuss the importance of aligning learning targets with assessment. We'll talk about some concepts such as validity, reliability, and fairness. We'll talk about the importance of positive consequences of assessment, both for you and your students, and we'll touch on some practicality and efficiency considerations. The vocabulary you'll be responsible for are on this screen, and along with the page numbers, and don't forget your extra credit vocabulary assignment. So we've been talking about how to know what should be assessed, and we said it's important to have a roadmap. And that roadmap are your standards and objectives and targets. Now the question is, how do you assess those? How do you make good, high quality assessments so that it's appropriate to it appropriately measures what students have learned? With high quality assessments or assessments that verify student learning, they should promote targeted student learning and motivation as well. It's important to align the methods of your assessment with learning targets. So you must consider different types of what we call methods of assessing. And four that your textbook talks about are here: selected response, constructed response, teacher observation, and student self-assessments. Each one of these types is good for a particular thing. So let's see what I mean. The two most common types of assessments are selected response and constructive response. These are often given out in paper and pencil types of tests and quizzes and homeworks and things. Selected response basically is any question where a student has to choose from among answers that are presented. So think about a multiple choice, for example. Students must select the correct response from a list that's provided. True, false. Students must select either true or false. And matching, students must select from one column to match to another column. That's why it's called selected response. Constructive response, on the other hand, students aren't presented with choices. They have to construct or write their own response. So some different types here are short answer, diagram, show your work. It could be something other than writing, though. It could be products such as a graph, a table, paper poems, web pages. Skills such as speaking, debating, reciting, music, keyboarding. All of these are performance tests where you ask the students to do something instead of write something, or instead of show what they know by writing. An essay, though, is also a constructive response because it it is students have to construct their own answers. And oral questioning, when you question students and they have to respond. So the thing that all of these things have in common, all of these types of items have in common, is that students have to construct their response. They're not given a choice like in selective response. There are other types of assessment methods that are less frequently used. Teacher observation. We observe all the time and we assess students through observation, but it's less formally done. Student self-assessment might be where they answer questionnaires or they evaluate their own work or others' work. For the rest of the class, we're primarily going to be talking about the first two types, though: selective response and constructive response. So, how do you know which of these four types is most appropriate for what you want to what you want to know? Well, the first thing you have to think about is um, what are you trying to get at? What knowledge are you trying to get at? Or what skill are you trying to get at? Let's say you have a learning target and it really is all about students knowing something, knowing dates, for example. Um, or maybe it's about simple understanding, if you were to remember those terms from last week. Well, you're probably going to use something that's selected response and simple constructive response. So these items are particularly good for measuring simple things like a multiple choice. Which of the following dates did Gettysburg have? For deeper understanding and reasoning, you're probably going to want to use other types of constructive response. Um, so essays, for example, are particularly good at measure deep understanding and reasoning. You can use selective response, but it must be cleverly constructed. And in the final examination for this course, you're going to see a number of multiple choice that require you to apply knowledge instead of just recall knowledge. If you're trying to assess skills, you're probably going to use performance assessments. And so it'll be a constructive response. Products, the same thing. And we're going to spend some time on performance assessments later in the course. If you're trying to assess affect, that is, students' dispositions, you're probably going to use observation or allow students to self evaluate. Most of what we do in the classroom is the first two, with a little bit on the third and fourth. How do you judge the quality of an assessment? Well, high quality assessment has really three components: validity, reliability, and fairness. So let's go into each one of these. What is validity? Validity is the appropriateness and legitimacy of an inference, claims, and uses made from scores that result from an assessment. In other words, how well it measures what it is intended to measure. Let's say you are teaching reading and you've taught a whole unit on main character. And you've read stories and asked students to identify main character, and you've tried to get them to understand what main character is. And then suppose on your test you have a bunch of questions about setting of the story. That would not be considered a very valid test because it didn't measure what you taught them. So validity is the degree to which a measurement accurately describes the real world, in a sense. And if you think about it, the observed score, or the score that the student actually gets, is actually consists of two things. The true score, which is what a measure of how they're actually doing, what they actually know, plus some measurement error. There's always a little bit of measurement error. And that measurement error makes the true score different from the observed score. Sometimes the measurement error is small and sometimes it's large. The larger the measurement error is, the less valid the test is or the assessment is. What could cause measurement error? Poorly worded questions that the students don't understand could cause measurement error. Test anxiety could cause measurement error. There are many things that could cause measurement error, and so you want to minimize that or keep it as small as possible so that the observed score is as close to the true score, what it should be, as possible. Some important points about validity is we say that something is more or less valid, not that it is valid or not valid. Think of validity as being on a continuum, and some assessments are more valid for a certain purpose than others. So you always say that an assessment is valid for a purpose. So getting back to my example, for example, of the test that measured setting, that might be a very valid test to measure students' knowledge of setting, but not to measure students' knowledge of character. And if they hadn't been taught setting, it would not be an appropriate test to use. An instrument can be valid, yet not useful if students have not been provided instruction, as in my previous example. So what evidence is used to establish validity of a test? Well, you might have some content related evidence. And so this means have the number of questions, the number of points aligned with the importance of the topic. So, for example, suppose, getting back to my example of main character, suppose you had taught a second thing and you had taught setting, but you spent 90% of your time on main character and 10% of your time on setting. But suppose the test had 90% of the questions on setting and only 10% on main character. Then that wouldn't be a very fair representation on the number of questions for each learning target. What a lot of teachers do is create a test blueprint or table of specifications, which is a two-way grid, and I'll show you one in a minute, showing the content and types of learning targets. Preparing this test blueprint before teaching a unit can help to ensure that your teaching is covering the intended content and targets. And by the way, it is a good idea to build the test before you teach, because then you know what you're asking students to learn better. So this is a diagram showing the importance of content alignment. Standards must learn with goals, learning objectives, and targets, and that must align with assessment. So you get this smooth alignment throughout. Again, your assessment should measure your learning target. Let's take an example. Suppose the learning target was, after reading 4 short stories, student will be able to identify the main characters using multiple choice questions with 90% accuracy. Notice that's a learning target because it includes an assessment and it includes a criterion for success. An appropriate test item for that might be, who is the main character in this short story? Do you see how that test item aligns with the learning target? If I had a test item there about setting, it wouldn't align appropriately with the learning target. Here's the blueprint or table of specifications that I mentioned earlier. On the left, we have an English language arts set of standard. We have a learning target column. We have the type of target that it is. Is it simple understanding or is it deeper understanding? You could have also put skill or product. The amount of instructional focus, in other words, how much time was spent teaching the target, and the type of items that should be used. So, for example, the first learning target is, after reading 4 short stories, students will be able to identify the main characters using multiple choice questions with 90% accuracy. If you think about that, that's a simple understanding. They just have to read it and pick out the main character. Suppose I had spent half of my instructional time, 50% on that. I would expect my test to have about 50% questions covering that target. And then the type of item, what would be appropriate for simple understanding? Well, we learned before that selected response is appropriate, so I'm going to do some multiple choice and true false to cover that. As a second learning target for the standard, I also wrote, students will be able to describe the main character using deep descriptive adjectives. Again, this is a simple understanding type of learning target. I only spent 30% of my instructional time on this. And because this is a describe, I probably don't want to use something like selected response. I want students to be able to describe it in their own words, so I'm going to use a short answer. The third target, students will be able to describe characters' motivation in a story. If you think about it, this requires a deeper understanding because the students had to identify the characters and how they interact with each other and leading to their motivations. I only spent 20% of the time on this though, and I'm going to have fewer questions on this, but I'm going to assess it with an essay, which is appropriate for deeper understanding type of questions. So suppose I use this blueprint or table of specifications to come up with 10 questions on this unit. I might have 5 of those questions, multiple choice and true false, to assess the first target. I might have 3 multiple choice and 2 true false, for example. Then I'd have another 3 short answer on the second learning target. And then I would have maybe 2 essays, or maybe even 1 essay, um, because an essay is a longer question, 1 or 2, asking them to read a short passage and describe some motivations. And so if I do that, then I've got a nicely aligned assessment aligned with the learning targets. What other type of evidence is used to establish validity of a classroom uh, test? Well, we talked about content evidence. Criterion related evidence of validity asks, do the results of this test agree with the results of another well established test of the same thing? Um, so, for example, if if a student takes if a student takes a test that is known to predict grade performance and the grades agree, and the student does well on that test, and then the student also does well on grades, then it's sort of a separate measure of the performance of the test. So also, can the results of this test be used to predict future performance? So for example, SAT scores are well-known predictors of the first year of success in college. So because of that, high SAT scores, high success in college. This is why colleges like to see SATs, because it can tell them the students that are going to do well in college. This is criterion-related evidence of validity. Another example might be that eighth graders' pre-algebra final grades may predict success in high school algebra. Now, you won't conduct formal studies of criterion-related evidence of validity, but you need to understand the principle in order to be able to explain it to students and parents. What can you do to enhance validity of classroom tests? Well, there are a number of recommendations. You can ask another teacher if what you are assessing is clear. Let another teacher read your test. You can prepare a detailed table of specifications, as we saw. You can ask another teacher to judge the match between the assessment items and the objections. Show your table of specs to another teacher. Include a sufficient number of items for each learning outcome. So this is probably where my previous test fell down. Although I did have one essay item, for that last target, what would happen if a student were a poor writer? He'd probably do very poorly at that target, but maybe he knows the content. So maybe what I want to do if I were revising that, I'd go back and I'd double the number of items and get students to have more items and variety of items for each target. Provide enough time for most students to complete the assessment. Use appropriate vocabulary, sentence structure, and item difficulty to avoid introducing irrelevant obstacles. So some teachers think they have to make the test tricky and hard, but in fact, the opposite is true. We want to make the test as clear as possible because we don't want the test directions, for example, tripping the students up and not giving a fair and accurate representation of what they know. You would be introducing measurement error into it by doing that. Ask easy questions first so that students don't give up but answer as many as they can. And use the results only for the intended purpose. So don't take, for example, if you teach science, don't take the science test and use it to assess students at being poor at math. Reliability is another consideration in high quality assessments. Reliability refers to the consistency of assessment results. For example, if you give the instrument again with no additional instruction to the same group, are you likely to get more or less the same results? Um, so if I give a test and I give it the next day and I haven't given instruction, taught them anything in between, I should get pretty much the same results. If not, there's some test error in there that's creating a problem. If students answer a particular question one way and see the question later on the test worded slightly differently, are they likely to answer it the same way? Now, there's a relationship between validity and reliability. To have validity, you must have reliability, but you can have reliability without having validity. That sounds a little confusing, but think about it. We can have a test that gives the same results again and again, but does not assess content well. In this case, we have reliability, but not validity. Think about my test about setting versus main character. All students might do poorly on it because they haven't been taught setting over and over and over again, so the test would have good reliability, but not good validity. But if you have a test that measures the content well, students are likely to give consistent answers. So if you have validity, you're going to have reliability. What can you do to enhance reliability? Well, provide very clear directions and guidelines for answering and scoring assessments. Use a sufficient number of items or tasks. Use independent raters if you have who provide similar scores for the same performance. This is like if you're trying to score writing samples and you have two writers, then those scores should be fairly close together. Construct items and tasks that clearly differentiate students on what is being assessed. And when we say items, we mean test items here, by the way. Make sure that assessment procedures and scoring are as objective as possible. That means that there's not a lot of room for bias or subjectivity, um, which is sometimes difficult to do with writing samples. That's why we use rubrics and things to grade essays. Continue assessment until results are consistent. Eliminate or reduce the influence of extraneous events or factors. So that bell that rings in the middle of the test is introducing some measurement error and probably going to affect the reliability. And finally, use shorter assessments more frequently than fewer longer assessments. All of these things can enhance reliability. Fairness is another consideration of high quality assessment. So this means, have students been taught the material appropriately, and is it assessing it appropriately? So students must have a knowledge of the learning targets and assessment. They must have been given an opportunity to learn the material. They must have the prerequisite knowledge and skills. So if you're teaching algebra, for example, they have to know how to do multiplication, or it's not a fair assessment. You should avoid stereotyping students in questions. So don't make questions up about how hard math is for girls. That's stereotyping. Avoid bias. So this is generally good teaching practice. We all have biases and we need to try to avoid writing about them in test items. And we need to accommodate diverse learners, and we'll learn more about that later in the course. Assessment should have positive consequences both for you, the instructor, and for the students. So the question is, how to assess to make the process more motivational? Well, practices that promote students' motivation to learn involve giving immediate and specific feedback, telling students what they did well or poorly, aligning tests to learning targets, not just testing them on anything, and providing tests that are challenging but not impossible. If students feel like there is no hope for your test, then they're going to stop trying. Plan the test before teaching and then teach to the test. And some teachers get upset when you hear this phrase, but really, teaching to the test ensures that students will learn what they need to learn. And then look at the test and use student errors to inform teaching or reteaching. These all lead to positive consequences and are likely to make your test more motivational. Practicality and efficiency are other considerations. We can't spend all our time grading and making up tests. So you need to learn some shortcuts. You need to learn quickly how to do some of these things we're going to be talking about in the test. And you can't spend all your time grading an hour on each assessment either. So, what are some factors to consider here? Do I know the strengths and limitations of the question types that I use and how to interpret results? So, know when to use a multiple choice, know when to use an essay. And later, when we do the quiz results, and you're going to have to use different types of items, it'll be important to look back at this chapter and write a rationale defending why you chose certain types of items for certain types of knowledge. This is the chapter you need to focus on, and particularly what we talked about earlier in this presentation about when to use multiple choice, when to use essay. Am I using the shortest assessment to give me the information that I need? Are the instructions clear? Here's a big one. Is the assessment easy to give and score? You probably don't want to give 10 essay items. You probably want to have some objective items, that is, items that are easy to score and quick. Are the results easy for me to interpret? And are the results useful for providing feedback to students and as a basis for grading? So these are all issues regarding practicality and efficiency. I hope this lecture has been helpful. Here are some of the big ideas. Assessments should be matched with learning targets and aligned with standards. It's important to think about the type of assessment to most appropriately use. An understanding of validity, reliability, fairness, and usability or ease of use is important in developing quality assessment. And there are useful techniques to ensure maximum quality for assessment instruments.